Українське незалежне радіо.
Joining me today on Ukraine Watch from the Black Sea port city of Odessa is Volodymyr Dubovyk, an associate professor in the faculty of the Department of International Relations at Mechnikov National University and the director of its Center for International Studies. Thank you very much for being here, Volodymyr.
Hello, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Last Friday, speaking at the White House, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor for the Biden administration, said Russia could potentially launch an invasion of Ukraine any day now, and he urged any Americans still in the country to leave immediately. The following day, during a visit to Ukrainian army outposts in Kherson, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, according to the president's official website, said, quote, "We are not afraid of anyone. Do not panic. Everything is under control." However, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has issued a formal protest over Russian plans to partially block the Black Sea under the guise of naval military exercises. This move by Russia could have devastating effects on Ukraine's economy by shutting down vital ports in Kherson and Odessa. Additionally, Western allies are canceling flights to and from Ukraine, and Western businesses are removing personnel. I want to start, Volodymyr, by asking you what the mood is like in Odessa, and does it feel like the West is isolating Ukraine?
Well, the times are testing, that's for sure, and the situation is tense. Some people feel it more than others. It really depends on who you talk to. Some people just outright dismiss the cautions and the forecast for the war. They don't think it's possible. Others are more paying attention, some in an alarmist mode. So it's really up to who you talk to. A lot of people have lived with Russian aggression for too long, for almost 8 years now. And that's why a lot of people just often say like, well, what's new? I mean, we had Russian troops on that side of the border all the time. So what was the element of novelty here? And that's what Zelensky is saying as well. And I think Zelensky is sending the right message to a large extent, not to panic, focus on defense, live your lives, but be aware of the Russian threat. But I also think that Jake Sullivan is sending right messages as well to Ukraine. Just be aware, Russia may be just a few days away from what they want to do, depending on what they want to do, because we still don't know. And sending a signal to Americans in Ukraine. I mean, if you care about the threat, you can leave. Or if you don't, I mean, you can stay. And there are many Americans who are staying. But then, of course, it's a message like you should leave or do not expect American government to come and rescue you in the middle of the war, because of the war. So that's kind of a responsible position, I think. And to Moscow as well. We know your plans. I mean, there are some plans that are leaking or leaked to us. We intercepted some plans or something. So I think it's an interesting game by Washington. It's been unique several weeks or months when Washington would immediately go to press with whatever they intercepted of Russian plans. Undermining those plans, making and forcing Moscow to redo them, and come up with some different plans, and maybe undermining their plans, maybe pushing them kind of down towards the closing of the window for the potential escalation or assault at Ukraine. Some people are saying there's a certain window that Russia would like to use if they are actually planning to assault Ukraine. On a larger scale, and by saying, okay, they're going to check on Wednesday, and the Russians say, oh, damn, we couldn't do it on Wednesday now because Americans said we're going to check Wednesday or maybe next week. Okay, so we should probably do it like in 10 days from now or something. So there's certain logic here as well, and I think there's a lot of messages that make sense, but at the same time, we are still at the status quo of the last several months with all this huge armies of Russia next to our borders, heavily equipped, several potential front lines. Of course, the emergence of the Belarus front line was an ominous addition because we didn't initially plan to protect from attack from the north, but now the attack from the north could be one of the most real and feasible scenarios, unfortunately, because of the proximity to Kiev. So we need to reinforce that part of the potential front line as well. So the situation is tense. People are aware of the threats, but life indeed does go on, and there's no panic, there's no hysteria, there's no empty shelves in the supermarkets, nothing of that sort.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. So you think perhaps the signaling from the Biden administration, I mean, we can't get into the mind of Vladimir Putin, but perhaps it's working sort of as a psychological deterrent?
I think it does. I think it does because Biden decided that, well, first of all, of course, there will be no boots on the ground. And we understand that in Ukraine. I mean, some people maybe don't. Some people would probably like to have American soldiers on our side against the Russian soldiers. That'd be great. But anyone who, like myself, who's been doing analysis of also this kind of sorts of things for years, we realize it's not going to possible. It's not going to be possible, and none of the armies from any other countries would join Ukrainians fighting Russians. The recent sociological poll actually done across the borders of various countries have shown that there's one country, probably unsurprisingly, where you even have a slight majority population liking the idea of maybe their own soldiers to be fighting with Ukrainians, together with Ukrainians against the Russians, as Poland. But that's it. Even there, of course, the government is not going to send Polish troops or something into Ukraine. But any other type of support, we appreciate it, be it the arms or weapons, little weapons, non-lethal weapons, be it financial assistance, be it diplomatic assistance, all of that. Ukraine is trying, to grasp at all the straws, and we're trying to play by the rules. We've applied, for instance, the other day, we've applied for a so-called Vienna Agreement protocol with the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, where Kiev asked Moscow to explain what's going on around our borders. And the window to do that is 48 hours. They passed. Moscow didn't provide any explanations. And therefore now Poland, actually, which is which is now heading the OSCE, can convene a session, and Russian delegation might come and try to explain what's going on and be embarrassed or miss this meeting, which is going to be still also embarrassing for the Moscow. So I think it does say a lot that these days Russia is often isolated. They do have some support from here and there. The major development here, of course, of the last few weeks is that China has stepped up, rhetorically at least, in support of Russia. But we're not talking about, we're not really talking about some kind of established, fully established strategic Chinese-Russian alliance here. But with regards to sending a big, middle finger to US, of course, they would be working together. And of course, they've made up with this huge Beijing resolution, or what's official name of it is, where they call for the multipolar world, where not only the West can actually dictate what's going to be happening, because here in Moscow and Beijing, we also have our say, and we have something to back it up with. Economic might, military forces, and so on. So the Chinese, at the same time, some people are saying, are not enthusiastic about any plans of Moscow to attack Ukraine, because it will be destabilizing. And I'm not only talking or even talking about Russia attacking while the Olympics are still on. Even if they do it after, if they do it, China might still be probably in an uneasy situation here, looking at their new major partner escalating the fight, even though, of course, Chinese propaganda will be blaming the West, the US and NATO and so on. But also China had big ideas about Ukraine, and penetrating there and actually making Ukraine potentially part of their belt and road. And I mean, the whole idea of expanding Chinese influence, including the financial investment and so on. So they would like to have a devastating war between Ukraine and Russia. And I wonder if this is a factor. On one hand, of course, they are rhetorically with Moscow, but on other, if this factor is moderating somehow what Moscow might do, because the recent visit of Putin to Chinese leader was unique because Putin wasn't meeting anyone for a long time, and Mr. Xi, the Chinese leader, hasn't met any foreign leaders for 2 years, I think, and then they meet, so it's a big deal. But at the same time, it could be that Beijing also said to Moscow, you know what, we are with you, but to some extent there are some red lines. Please don't cross those red lines. It's hard to say. It's all speculation, of course, because we don't know. But there are so many factors here in play, and I think Ukraine is trying to make the best out of it. We don't have a strong hand, but we do have certain strong points, including our army, which is much stronger, better equipped, more experienced than we used to have a few years ago. And right now, it's definitely one of the better armies in the world. Of course, Russia still has upper hand. It's asymmetric conflict. It's Russia. They invest tons of money into it. They have resources. They have nukes if they want to use them. Hopefully not. But our army is still strong, and they can deliver devastating defensive counterstrikes against Russians if they decide to do this crazy thing and attack Ukraine on a larger scale.
Well, I actually want to ask you to speculate a little bit more, because supposing there was some kind of worst case scenario where Russia did indeed launch an all-out escalation of invasion on the territory of Ukraine, there would likely be some harsh sanctions, or at least the West has signaled that, and perhaps Moscow wouldn't be able to sell gas to the Western countries anymore. Do you think that would jeopardize also, based on what you're saying about China, their deal, or Putin's new deal to sell gas to China?
I don't think so. I think it's actually Putin's backdoor solution. If they have somehow lose the European market, then there's a Chinese market. But experts say, they tell us that it's not going to be a substitute. The Chinese market is big, but it's going to take time to develop it. And if Russia somehow loses European market now, that's going to be a difficult moment economically for Russia. And Europe is already learning in the recent few months the things that they should learn years before, that they shouldn't be depending on Russia exclusively. They should diversify the sources. They've been talking about this for years and years. And all of a sudden, it's only in the recent months that people in Berlin and Paris and elsewhere are suddenly realizing, oh my God, how did it come to us depending so much on Russian supply of natural gas? So yeah, so then Qatar is coming in, and Norway is pushing the outputs to the maximum what they can provide, and then of course American LNG, liquefied natural gas, is coming in record numbers. So it's going to be maybe some sort of a reorientation of European market in the coming years, and then people are already saying that could be backfiring on what Russia is doing right now, because people after all might say, you know what, we probably don't need to have, a partner providing us with gas, which is Russia, because Russia is so unpredictable with what they do in Europe, in their region, and so on. So that is interesting. I think that we're going to see some unexpected results. And already Putin got some negative outcomes of this escalation. For instance, people in Finland and Sweden are thinking out loud about maybe joining NATO, something which wasn't talked about so intensively in previous years. Right. Others are alarmed as well. For instance, Bulgaria, where you have a strong current of pro-Russian sentiment, but when it was mentioned by Moscow diplomacy, quite recently, the Bulgarian prime minister had to come out and say, look, it's not for Moscow to tell us what to do. If we want to be part of the EU and NATO, that's our decision. So there is a backlash against Moscow, even in Bulgaria. So there are many things where they're kind of losing already. Not to mention that there's been a lot of panic here, panic there on the fund markets, stock markets, and so on. And some Russian corporations and some banks already lost some of their money. So the sanctions might be a way forward, and unfortunately, that's the only way forward for the West, because the instrumentarium, as they say, the toolbox for the West is not huge. I mean, what can you do if you're not sending troops? You've tried diplomacy. What else? It's sanctions. So it's just a matter of how much of sanctions, which level, who do you sanction? Is it sectoral? Is it individuals? Is it both? So Russians are now saying, they're putting this brave expression on their faces like, oh, we don't care. I think today or yesterday, the Russian ambassador to Sweden said something like, we don't give a damn about your sanctions, except that he didn't say damn it, he said worse. But they do, by saying this, they actually not necessarily, they're showing bravado, but at the same time, they might be actually masking their uneasiness about what those sanctions might do. And I hope there will be some, if they attack Ukraine on a larger scale, there will be some, as they say, nuclear sanctions. And I hope that Russians are going to suffer through that because, there's no other way. But it's true, they've accumulated some money, like the reserve fund, the stabilization fund is huge. I think it's something like $650 billion. But if the sanctions are systemic enough, the Russians can eat through that fund quickly, actually. And if they lose some of the markets, that's also a big loss for them. So, I think they're really weighing hard now what they're going to win, the cost and benefits, but at the same time, there is a stretch. I'm afraid that Putin is a bit unhinged now, that he is not a rational player as we used to know him, that he can do irrational things, crazy things, that he's too emotional, too passionate, too illogical about Ukraine specifically because of his recent speeches and articles and everything about Ukraine as artificial state and Ukraine and Russian being one people, and that whole thing should be corrected, and the whole dissolution of Soviet Union was a tragedy, biggest tragedy of his life. And at least there should be Eastern Slavs all together in one kind of union, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. So those crazy things that he is saying or writing publicly, I think that he's speaking his mind, and that's making him kind of dangerous.
Hey, you mentioned that article that he wrote about the sort of the unity of Ukrainian and Russian people. I was surprised to see the Ukrainian language on the Kremlin website because he published it in Ukrainian and English. It's sort of, I don't know what to make of it, because if the world were to be thrown into chaos because I guess one man or one circle were to decide to start a larger war, how long could they possibly last with the only lifeline being selling gas to China?
Well, I don't know. It's most of the time it's one person, actually. If you look at the history, the First World War was actually a bunch of people who were doing responsible things, and that ended badly. Second World War is basically Hitler, one person, but then Stalin actually doing similar things. Look at what Mao did at one point of time. So, and most of the time, just one person who doesn't have any checks and balances, doesn't have any limits of his or her power, and they, therefore push the war towards a disaster. So Putin is one of those men, and I'm afraid he's living in this bubble, which is even smaller these days. We don't know much about what's going on in the Kremlin, just because it's very murky, it's very non-transparent, always been. But right now, what we're hearing is that he's hardly socializing with anyone, that people are coming to him and putting some information in his table, and he would look at it, and he would even say a word back to them, and the people would leave the office not knowing what he's thinking, what he's planning, where he's leaning to. Look at all of this Lavrov, the foreign minister, and others, speaking publicly in the recent weeks and months, and it's obvious they have no idea what Putin is planning to do. Even some people in his inner circle, they say, we don't know. So it's so non-transparent. And, like I said, we can only hope that there is some rationality left there, that, pushing towards the brink, towards the disaster, he wouldn't be bringing Ukraine and other countries in the region with it, because it's not going to be just Ukraine, obviously. This whole crisis is not just about Ukraine, and that's why it's not right even to call it the Ukraine crisis. It's Russia crisis, it's Ukraine, Russia, Belarus crisis, it's Ukraine, Russia, Central Europe crisis. So it's Ukraine, Russia, US crisis. It's huge crisis where you have all these elements. If you look at the Russian so-called security proposals from December 17th, they're talking about half of NATO. They think that everything should be undone, what was done with NATO enlargement since 1997. So, and that's 14 countries out of 30, so it's almost half of NATO. That's a huge crisis. We still don't know what to make of those security proposals. Why Moscow put all of this unrealistic, demands in there? Did they want actually them to be dismissed, to use it as to say, well, we haven't been heard, we've been ignored. That's why we have to use military tools. Or did they, after all, wanted to for the West to come up with some alternative ideas and suggestions that might be interested to Moscow? That is still possible. Because even formally, in Moscow, they say, well, our major concerns are not being addressed, but there are some things that we can work with the West diplomatically. Second-rate matters, they call them, but who knows? Some people are saying that US have put forward some suggestions that if being put forward, say, half a year ago, a year ago, that would be enthusiastically accepted in Moscow these days, about the nuclear missiles placing, about transparency, non-transparency of exercises, and so on and so on. So we'll see. I mean, surprisingly, even now, when we talk about this after months of escalation, we still couldn't just quite decipher and figure what is going on. Is it a real preparation for invasion, or is it some kind of amazing, very expensive, huge systemic intimidation game, a big bluff, maybe biggest in the world history?
Well, I want to circle back to talking about the administration's actions this week. In a piece for Европейская Правда published back in January 20th, you wrote that the greatest challenge for the Biden administration thus far has been the escalation of Russian military presence on Ukraine's border. Do you think the administration's urgent call for Americans to leave Ukraine has something to do with the desire to avoid a repeat of the horrifying scenes we saw from the U.S. Exit from Afghanistan? Absolutely. This is definitely an echo of what happened in Afghanistan. This administration came to power trying to project confidence, and they said we're very experienced, we plan for everything, we have some capable people responsible for that direction, and all of a sudden there was this chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Others are actually saying that probably it was inevitable. Once Americans announced they're going to leave Afghanistan, there would be some chaos on the ground, but maybe too much of it we saw in August last year. So yes, first of all, it's an attempt to try not to repeat that. And second of all, it's also an attempt not to get a major foreign policy embarrassment. And I think it's going to be, if Ukraine is attacked and US is not playing decisive role in helping Ukraine, I think it's going to be a much larger embarrassing and a loss and a tragedy for American foreign policy than Afghanistan. Frankly, because Afghanistan has a special role in American history and foreign policy, because that's where the people who did 9/11 came from, obviously. So that's why. But at the same time, Afghanistan not necessarily in the part of the war which was extremely critically important for US, but Ukraine is, because during the Cold War, which is almost all second half of 20th century, Ukraine was part of that area, which is now post-Soviet space. And if they lose here, then definitely there'll be a lot of voices on all corners in US asking, like, who lost Ukraine, or how that even was possible. And I'm not only even talking about usual politicization, between the parties. I'm not only talking about Republicans asking. I'm sure there'll be other voices asking, about this. And by the way, I should say that I'm really disappointed about the position that the left wing of Democratic Party is coming up with on all this. All of a sudden, it's still, bad wolf US, bad wolf American imperialism, and somehow Russia is in position of a righteous warrior or fighter for their rights. I don't know what's going on with the West. There is a Stop the War coalition. There is a former leader of Labour Party, Corbyn, speaking at meetings and manifestations and demonstrations in London. But also Progressive Caucus in US, and I should tell you, I'm kind of a liberal person, ideologically I often agree with what they're saying, but this time around, it's not Biden who is escalating. It's not Biden who is escalating by sending this, 2, 3, maybe 4,000 people, and not to Ukraine, but to Poland and Romania. But it is Putin who is escalating by sending 150,000 people with no reason whatsoever, and how can you, they say that Biden should be engaged in diplomacy. That's exactly what he was doing. But in the face of what Putin is doing and not listening to the words of reason, you have to send certain deterring kind of signals, specifically to calm down the people who are really worried right now. Romanians are worried with this ongoing Navy exercises in the Black Sea. They are.
Baltics worried, Poles really worried, specifically with Belarus, which is basically not a state anymore, but somehow occupied by Russia. All of a sudden, they have Russian troops on the border. I mean, the Poles were always being thinking that, thanks God, we have Ukraine and Belarus between us and Russia. And now there's no Belarus, basically, and what happens to Ukraine matters enormously to Poland. So everyone is really alarmed in the region, and it's not Washington which led to this. If anything, we've seen in the last several months the logic and rationale for why all these countries in Central Eastern Europe were rushing to NATO the moment they got this opportunity in the 1990s. That's why, because now there is a collective security and collective defense working for them. Otherwise, can you imagine any of those smaller countries being vis-a-vis Russia without any support from a major alliance? They'll be pretty much doomed.
Yeah, and I mean, there's already been an issue at the border between Poland and Belarus prior to this with the migrant crisis. You bring up some interesting points about what's going on in sort of Western politics. I was going to ask you about this a little bit later in our conversation, but I think it's a good point to bring it up now. So if the current tensions with Moscow don't diminish anytime soon, and they may not, are you concerned that a change in who controls Congress after the U.S. midterm elections this November could impact the level of support and attention Ukraine is getting from the Biden administration right now?
No, I don't actually, because I see a lot of consensus here. Yes, there have been some frictions here and there, like for instance, there have been different bills suggested of what to do about the Russian escalation. I mean, what you do with the Nord Stream 2, but also what you do with sanctions. Do you do them right now because Russians are escalating already, or you wait actually till they actually invade Ukraine further? So there are many, little tactical details which are important, but on the strategic level, there is absolute agreement between two major parties that Russia is a threat and Ukraine is a friend, and Ukraine needs to be supported. Of course, there are some fringes, as I've said, and not only on left, extreme left in the Democratic Party, but also, of course, on a kind of a radical right. I'm sure that listeners of your program would have different, ideological inclinations, so they are free to decide for themselves. But also, when we hear people on the right, for instance, Senator Hawley or Senator Rand Paul or some others in the House as well, including some newer members in the House, who say, Russia is actually a good guy here and Ukraine is not, and why are even involved? I understand there is a certain libertarian, isolationist wave in US as well, especially after many, many years of being involved in endless wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, specifically in Afghanistan. I understand the logic of that because I study US, that's my field. I study US domestic and foreign policy, US-Ukraine relations. But having said that, in terms of a future of support for Ukraine in the Congress on the Hill, I see those fringes, but they're not dictating the rules of the game. There is still strong consensus, moderate center on both sides, two parties working together. And that's how it used to be. And that's why I'm reasonably optimistic in terms of Ukraine continuing to enjoy support of American Congress.
Well, and yet, I appreciate that point. And yet you see former Democratic candidate for president showing up on a very popular talk show on Fox News saying things like Ukraine is not a democracy, opposition television channels are being shut. Tulsi Gabbard. Opposition television stations are being shut down, and opposition political leaders are being rounded up and arrested. I hope that this is falling on deaf ears, but I wonder if that's influencing anybody of consequence, or do you think it's just silly?
It's mostly silly. I don't know what's her game. She started saying this kind of things early on when it was obvious that she's not moving anywhere with her campaign for the nomination for the presidency, and quickly she became a darling of Tucker Carlson show, and she is often there. And that's interesting because you have if you think about it, I've talked about radical left and some alt-right, and they're meeting together. Somehow this circle is connecting. That's interesting. Some people actually call it the red-brown coalition, meaning red's, communist, extreme left, brown being, and so on. And I don't know what's going on. Obviously, she's not influential, but for some people, the other day, I think Edward Snowden spoke up, and he said it's West which is warmongering, it's Western media which is doing this. And people are saying, really? We're just covering what's going on. We're just looking at these armies and all of these missiles coming in, and Russian National Guard coming in, and the tanks and everything, and now ships, and also the Air Force being prepared, and paratroopers. We're looking at that. So should we ignore that? Why would any reasonable media person ignore such developments? Of course they're reporting on this, but they are not beating the drums of war. Putin does. So trying to shift the blame on Washington, how it reacts actually in a very modest, kind of a cautious way. Not to mention media which is reporting on it. It's a really strange game. So can you imagine that media would be actually ignoring this story? It's a big story. Of course they should report on it.
When you mentioned earlier, Ukraine is an ally of the United States. Ukraine is a democracy. There's sort of a values-driven argument for why the West should care about Ukraine. Right. Is there in your mind a more pragmatic argument, meaning to say, if you were talking to, say, an American citizen or somebody in the West who's a little bit skeptical about whether or not it's in the United States' interests to support Ukraine, or should they just stay out of it? It's not their fight. What would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, well, first of all, values thing is a big thing. I can remember the 1990s, and there was this concept of enlargement of a community of countries that are based on democratic values and the market economy under Clinton administration, and Ukraine was a major part of it. And then there was a democracy promotion, which is often discredited, but I think it was a good thing. I mean, America believing in democracy, believing in those values, believing in its own model, and trying to share it with the rest of the world, not necessarily impose it, enforce it on someone, but if you like this idea, we can help you to build this model within your own country. Why not? And actually, I was disappointed that with a few recent administrations, they stopped doing that as enthusiastically, for various reasons, and that's why I think value thing is important. Ukraine is democracy, maybe imperfect, maybe sometimes messy, maybe sometimes hesitant, like doing one right thing and then another one which is not right, move in the wrong direction. It happens. Still immature. Still, you have sometimes this opportunistic flip-flopping politicians. You still have quite a lot of corruption around. That influences what's going on in Ukraine, but in a general way, it's a major difference between Ukraine and Russia. In Ukraine, you have pluralism opinions, you have different political parties, you have free elections. If the guy loses, he loses. Poroshenko, whatever, he lost in a landslide, but of course he had this resources, administrative resources, and army, security service, and police, and everything. If he would want it, he would stay, like Lukashenko did, or Putin is staying. But no, of course he lost. Okay, I'm going. So here comes a new guy, Zelensky. And that's a major difference. The people can speak their minds freely. I'm a university professor in Ukraine. If I'm critical of what the government is doing, I'm saying it openly. If I am critical, if I think they deserve criticism, and I talk to my students during the lectures, I'm critical of my government. No one is coming to tell me what to do, what to say. No one is taking me away because of that. In Russia, it's quite different. The people who are talking to the students, my colleagues there, they have to watch, closely what they're doing. So on the values thing, it's a big thing that Ukraine is actually is an ally, natural ally for US. On other things, the international order is something that Americans invested enormously over decades and decades. And that's why when it's violated, since 2014, starting from Crimea and all the way to up to now, not to mention potential escalation and new invasion, of course Americans should stood up with it. Americans wanted this order to be put in a certain way, and they've invested all this energy and money and resources, and they should keep it. Defending it, the energy pipelines, the energy flow between certain countries to the east of Ukraine, to the countries of Europe, most of the European countries are American traditional partners. So here's a say for Americans in that particular respect. Then military developments. If Russia becomes a military dominant player all over the former Soviet Eurasia, that's a threatening thing for Americans. Be it their positions in the Middle East, or their relations with Turkey, or their positions in the Balkans even. Look, Russians are even looking at the steering troubles in the Balkans again. And it's not as stable as it was even a couple of years ago. The Balkans, the Western Balkans, the Eastern Balkans as well. So, I mean, there are many, many dimensions that America, even if it's trying to go away a little bit and focus now on China, well, it's been reminded you can't do that. You're still a global power. You know, you still have to be present here and there, not just in China. Not to mention, if you withdraw from this or that region to focus on China, you're leaving those regions either to China or Russia. They feel this vacuum of security, of power. You know, they get stronger. Americans are withdrawing. And what does it tell us about the potential for this US-China struggle in the coming decades? So I think there are so many, and I don't want to even go on with that list. There are so many reasons for why America should stand strongly with Ukraine in many ways.
So what do you think? What do you think the United States can do? Is there a diplomatic resolution to this standoff?
Well, there's a diplomatic resolution if Russia wants to listen, but if they want to ignore it, if they're just deaf, you know, I mean, what can you do? There was this recent visit of a foreign minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, to Moscow, and then Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said she came absolutely unprepared, which to me immediately said she came really well prepared. You know, that's what it means. And he said it was a dialogue of a, you know, deaf person to the mute person. But okay, if you don't want to listen to the logic, to the reason, you know, what can you do? I mean, what else you expected? There was a Macron visit before that, and Putin was going on all of his crazy, you know, escapades, and Macron just stood there, not replying, not responding, not criticizing, not reacting in any way. And he was immediately ridiculed and said, like, why would you stand there, president of France, you know, the free democratic Western country, and not even trying to push back? You know, quickly there was criticism even domestically within France. And so I think if Russia wants to listen to diplomacy, they will. If they made up their minds, or making up their minds not to, and ignore diplomacy and go with what they call this military technical tools, they will do that. So I mean, it still could have two tracks, I'm afraid, and we don't know which way it's gonna go. US is still trying. Every major announcement or statement by American leaders is mentioning that the diplomatic track is open. We can talk to you, Russia, on some important issues to you, but not on something which is not debatable, like, for instance, the open doors for NATO, or the principle of sovereignty of countries in the region. You know, you cannot curtail them, Russia. You cannot tell them how to live their lives. They're independent countries. On such issues, of course, there could not be a debate or dialogue or discussion. On anything else, there could be. And that's a message from Washington, and will it work? We'll see.
You mentioned French President Macron and some of the diplomatic talks going on between Russia and the UK, but it seems like the United States is really the one they want to talk to. But I also want to ask you, if supposing, sort of hypothetically, supposing the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin agreed to meet on neutral territory, I wouldn't say in Minsk anymore, but do you think that there's a deal that can be made there? Do you think that there's any influence that sort of an arrangement can have on the situation, or is that a lost cause?
It's hard to say. They're so entrenched right now, both of them. I mean, Putin is really wanting to get results out of Ukraine, out of a meeting with Zelensky, if that such meeting happens. Zelensky is entrenched as well. I mean, he also said, those are the red lines we cannot cross. And he couldn't, because again, it's a democratic country. You have part of the country which wouldn't allow him. You have these limitations on the power. He is not a dictator or an emperor. He decides what to do, and the rest of the country says, fine, that's what he decided to do. Of course not. Every time there is even even some kind of a hypothesis or suspicion that Zelensky might cross the red lines on Donbass, immediately everyone is up in arms, figuratively speaking, quotation marks, Like we should allow him to do it, because no, to talk directly to the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, so-called republics, you cannot do that. First of all, they're nobodies. We should talk to Moscow because they're behind them. They're, these people in Donetsk and Luhansk are puppets of Moscow. Second of all, they're terrorists. They have blood of our soldiers in their hands. So how can you talk to them? Or any other, on the Minsk, of course, Ukraine is trying to say, well, look, we're trying to implement Minsk, but there are limits again. We've been saying, look, let's do the security, part first. Let's disarm people. Let's put arms. Let's put international observers in. Let's have some healing period, at least of several months. And of course, return the control of the border between Ukraine and Russia to Ukrainian border guards. And some of those things. And then we can have elections. And if the people there would vote for some parties, that would not be really liking Kyiv in many ways, so be it. But Russians are saying, let's have elections right now. What do you mean right now? With all of this militias in arms, like they did the so-called referendum in March of 2014 in Crimea, when you basically had a tank and people with machine guns everywhere when the vote was ongoing. And of course, no one believes the result, official results, and there were leaked numbers of the actual figures that they got there. That kind of shame referendum and solution in Donetsk and Donbass is not going to work. And if they want to, push the Donbass back to Ukraine on Russian conditions and therefore undermine our sovereignty and give them some kind of a special veto power to control entire country of Ukraine. I mean, we're talking about like 7% of population or territory there. And why should those people be having veto power over entire country of Ukraine? That's just not fair. And that's why, of course, that's our red line. And that's why it's hard, of course, for us to agree in the Minsk format or Normandy format, or if Zelensky and Putin meet together again. I think there's not much of a space between them that they can actually meet halfway. So it's difficult. It's difficult. One or another should give in or should make some concessions, and no one is actually seeming to be willing to do that now.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Ukraine's civil society and their reaction to Zelensky potentially crossing a red line. I'm paying attention to Ukrainian social media and even just the traditional TV channels, and you see sort of, it's what you might expect in a Western country. You see opposing viewpoints. You see people who support the president. You see people who are critics of the president. It's interesting to see. But for our listeners who might not know or be familiar with the Minsk agreements, I mean, just if you were to boil it down, I guess my thinking, and you can tell me if this is accurate. Putin would kind of want these sort of separatist regions or so-called separatist regions to have veto power over decisions made in Kyiv. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, maybe just explaining what that Minsk agreement is, and also do these constituents, if you want to call them that, do they have a legitimate grievance? Is this a grassroots, your Kyiv, you're infringing on my rights, or is it something other than that? Is it something that's not Ukrainian or not grassroots or not real?
Right. Well, not Ukrainian, not real, not grassroots. I mean, the people who are now running those so-called republics, they're nobodies. I mean, they've been parachuted into the region by Russia. Some of them were actually Russians, not even Ukrainian citizens. They were complete unknowns. I mean, there were some grassroots political organizations there, but none of them actually made any career within the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So the people who I know from Donetsk, they would say, we've never heard their names. How come they're running now our cities and those regions? So, of course, they have completely no agency there and no say, and shouldn't have any say. And that's what Ukraine is saying. If you want to talk about a solution, let's talk Kyiv to Moscow. Why should we talk even to these people? We shouldn't be legitimizing them. And that's complicated here because, of course, it might have had some grievances before, but without Russian interference, there wouldn't be any even single shot fired in Donbass. We had some acute political crisis in Ukrainian history since 91. Normally, they'll be solved through the political crisis, through the elections. like the early one, for instance, in 1994, the Kravchuk ran into trouble at that point of time. First President Leonid Kravchuk had trouble with his opposition and the parliament, and they had snap elections. You know, he had 2 years to go. He said, "That's fine. We have a crisis. Let's have a vote." They had a vote. He lost. Kuchma came into power in 1994, and most of the time it was like this, you know. Or if it's acute crisis like Orange Revolution, for instance, in 2004, you know, if there's evidence of fraud and falsification, let's have a rerun of elections, and that's how Yushchenko won, for instance. So that's a usual way. I'm gonna reconnect my computer here to the power source. That's the usual way for Ukraine. Why 2014 and Donbass is different? Because you had a major interference of an external player, being Russian. And that's why. And that's why Kharkiv and Odessa turned out as a way. Because you didn't have such a major interference there. You had some interference, obviously, but not in such a massive numbers like in Donbass. I call Odessa and Kharkiv Donbass light, where you had some pro-Russian agents and segments and sentiments in the population for sure, but they were not that well prepared, not that well trained, not that well armed by Russia, and that's why they didn't prevail neither in Kharkiv nor in Odessa, for instance. Unlike in Donbass, because there you actually had a special operation cleverly and skillfully prepared in Moscow.
I want to kind of continue on that point. If you would indulge me for a minute, I remember watching a video back in 2014, around the time that this sort of failed Novorossiya project was going on, where Moscow was saying, "Oh, there's all these people who have pro-Russian sentiments in Ukraine, and they're just waiting to be liberated." And I remember seeing this short video of, I think it was in Donetsk, so you know, in the Donbass. There's people chanting, "Donetsk is a Russian city" in Russian. Although maybe this is just me, I noticed they were using, this may be nothing, could be something. They were using the sound, I guess in a Ukrainian accent, it's my understanding that you might sometimes hear the word city, Gorod, pronounced with the H, and it sounded like they were pronouncing it with a Russian accent. And then they were burning a flag of the Donetsk Shakhtar, which was the local soccer team's flag, because maybe it looked like a pro-Ukrainian flag. And I thought, well, that kind of solidifies it there. These are not locals.
Many of them were not locals. Of course, they've been shifted across the border. Some were locals, unfortunately, and that's not surprising because for years and years there have been this major penetration by Russia into Ukraine's information space. You actually had millions of Ukrainians tuning into Russian news stations on a daily basis, and they were shaping people's mindsets, unfortunately, in many places in the east and south of Ukraine. So that was problematic, and we've been talking about it, and some of what we've had since 2014 is results of that, you know, kind of uncensored penetration and access of Russian media into Ukraine's information space. But yes, of course, there's been a lot of intervention, and I mean, obviously, these militia forces in Donetsk, Luhansk republics, they wouldn't stand a chance. I don't know. It was 1 week maybe against the Ukrainian military. Even back then in 2014, you know, they were on the losing side until Russians brought the regular forces in as a reinforcement, and that's how they defeated Ukrainians first near Ilovaisk, and then later on at Debaltseve, and that's how you got Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. Was when Ukraine had a gun against our head, and we didn't have a position to negotiate because we were coming out of a major painful defeats, and that's what Russia is trying to do maybe this time again. But I'm afraid that they wanna you know elevate the scale of Ukraine's defeats to enforce even more concessions from Ukraine.
Do Russian speakers in Ukraine, do you think they want to be liberated by Putin? Is there any language issue in Ukraine at all?
You know, it depends on who you talk to. Some people are really caring about this issue, and they kind of nurture themselves, or maybe what's the right word? They put themselves in some kind of frenzy that they're indeed oppressed. But I wouldn't say that. I'm myself a Russian-speaking person from Odessa. Most people in Odessa speak Russian, you know, to each other and their friends and their family members. I've never felt repressed or discriminated against, frankly. But some people would say, yes, we've been discriminated. So I think what's been going on in the recent years actually has been very mild, very gradual Ukrainization, nothing being imposed or enforced, but we're just suggesting that you can maybe pick up more of using Ukrainian, and it's working, especially with younger generation. I'm seeing with my students, every new year, I'm seeing more and more people there in the room, in the classroom, who are more fluent with Ukrainian, even though most of them are local guys from the city of Odessa. So it's kind of working, and the whole political linguistic issue is not that relevant anymore since 2014, because before 2014 it was a major thing. But since 2014, you have a lot of Russian speakers fighting on Ukrainian side in the trenches in Donbass. Often journalists would come and talk to them, to our Ukrainian soldiers, and they would talk to the journalists in Russian. Doesn't matter, he's a strong, patriot of his country. He's willing to sacrifice his life, to defend this country. So it doesn't matter which languages they're speaking. So therefore, in a way, it's a trans-language situation right now. This question, this issue, might come back into Ukrainian politics like it was before 2014, but for right now, no one is even trying to capitalize on this issue anymore.
And you mentioned Odessa being mostly a Russophone city. Tell me, I'm going to get the facts wrong on this, but during that period of time, shortly after the annexation of Crimea, the 2014 events, and all that kind of stuff, there was sort of a situation in Odessa.
Yes.
Where there was a showdown.
Right.
And yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what that was, if you know, well, as
Sure.
far as you can?
Sure. So in a trail of Crimean annexation or occupation in the late February and the early first half of March 2014, and then Donbass fighting started. There was a very volatile, unstable, shaky situation in Odessa for a while, where you had a pro-Ukrainian segment, a pro-Russian segment, doing their demonstrations and manifestations and being very active. And it culminated on May 2nd of 2014 with very unfortunate events when 48 Odessans were killed on that day. There was this fighting, and all of a sudden, I don't know, the pro-Russian crowd probably thought they're going to have upper hand in numbers, but they didn't. They were actually quite quickly outnumbered by pro-Ukrainian people who didn't want for Odessa to follow the example of Donetsk and Slavyansk. We already saw those examples, and we saw the model, and a lot of people said we don't want to go that way. And there was this fighting, and there was a fire, major fire at the trade union building, and some people died there as well, which was a great tragedy. And also a wake-up call to a lot of Odessans, because Odessa was actually often seen before that as a very tolerant city, laid back, unpolitical, non-political, basically city oriented towards business and not politics. And then all of a sudden you have these clashes and people are dying. Therefore, it's been a trauma. It's been a teaching lesson in many ways. There's been some mediation efforts. But also that particular episode showed that the Putin's idea of the Novorossiya, that everyone in the south and the east just loves Russia, was also wrong. I mean, apparently these people who were curating all these events from Moscow, they just miscalculated in terms of numbers of people who were willing to greet Russia as a liberator. But these times there will be someone, of course, obviously, if the Russian troops come, there will be some people who will be saying and coming out to the streets and bringing flowers to the Russian troops. But the numbers, I don't know. But that kind of segment in Ukrainian population in the south and the east was always there. So therefore, we shouldn't be saying that Ukraine is just like 100% of all Ukrainians are absolutely united. But at the same time, the degree of consolidation is strong, like it was in 2014. Now again, the more Russia is threatening, the more Russia is hurting Ukraine, the bigger is degree of consolidation of Ukrainians and rallying around the flag.
Well, things are peaceful now, at least, and I hope they remain that way. Thank you again. Thank you again for speaking with me, Volodymyr. It was a pleasure talking to you. I'm speaking with Volodymyr Dubovyk. He's an associate professor in the faculty of the Department of International Relations at Mechnikov National University in the southern Ukrainian city of Odessa. And he is the director of that university's Center of International Studies. I'm Dan Terleckyj, and this has been another episode of Ukraine Watch. Thank you.
Українське незалежне радіо.